King Charles has had a very difficult and exhausting few months. And from everything sources are saying, it's only going to get worse from here. There's a story developing at Balmoral Castle right now that honestly feels like it's been building for years. It involves the woman who spent decades maneuvering her way into the heart of the royal family, ultimately altering the course of the British monarchy. Within the last 48 hours, a critical decision was handed down. It was a phone call that lasted less than 10 minutes, serving as the kind of conversation someone has when they've already made the decision. Sources say this call was not a discussion, but rather a direct and final directive. Lawyers have already confirmed the decision, and there is absolutely no turning back. This tense conversation was merely the first move in a total reorganization of the Crown's most private estates. The question everyone is asking now is why the king chose this exact moment to draw a line in the sand. To understand his timing, you have to look at the immense pressure currently weighing on the monarch. He is a man acutely aware of his legacy, his limited time, and his duty to the historic crown. For decades, Camilla's rise was marked by a gradual, calculated accumulation of influence that secured her family's place within the royal fold. She spent years ensuring her inner circle was protected, quiet, and extremely comfortable. Why, after decades of careful accommodation, has the king suddenly reversed course on the Balmoral estate? Sources say the answer has two distinct parts, and you need both of them to understand what is actually going on. First, the institutional control of the royal estates has fundamentally changed under his reign. The king now directly manages over $20 billion in crown assets. All of this wealth is under his direct authority, requiring absolutely no approval or consultation from anyone else. The moment Charles took over these properties, Camilla's son's name stopped appearing on the guest lists and long-term residency records for the Balmoral Cottages. It was no public dispute or formal statement, but rather a quiet and total removal. That decision sent a sharp message that did not need any translation. Royal commentators picked up on it immediately, noting it was causing significant ripples inside the palace walls. Sources suggest Prince William approved of the move completely, fully validating his father's swift and decisive action. This particular decision is also anchored to a deep, historical tragedy that still haunts the family. August 31st, 1997 will soon mark 30 years since Princess Diana lost her life. It has been 3 decades since her young sons had to walk behind her coffin in front of the entire world. Charles is now a monarch and a grandfather who has spent his entire life balancing his current marriage with the heavy, lingering ghost of his past. Sources say the king reached a point where he was completely done allowing institutional accommodation to override his private convictions. He is refusing to let the system ignore the deep feelings of his heirs any longer. Princess Anne has access to something that is now making certain people inside Buckingham Palace genuinely nervous. There is a highly restricted room at Windsor Castle called the Royal Archives. It allows no tourists, no documentary crews, and absolutely no public access. What it contains is the unfiltered and privately recorded history of the British royal family. It holds letters, diaries, and internal correspondence detailing what actually happened during the most turbulent decades. What exactly is in those archives that certain people allegedly do not want surfacing right now? While the broad strokes of the public scandals are already well known, the raw files go much deeper. The private tapes, the formal separation, and the bitter media briefings are already documented and debated. What sources suggest is, in those archives goes far beyond those familiar public details. It is the specificity of the private contemporaneous written record of who knew what and when they knew it. This file reveals exactly how the family dynamic was systematically altered behind closed doors. Now, Camilla's inner circle is facing a rapidly deteriorating situation. The king has been using his financial control with a precision that people inside her circle are only now fully appreciating. Access to crown events and proximity to official royal occasions have been quietly withdrawn from her wider family. Appearances where her family members had expected to be present have been restructured without any public explanation. None of these individual changes generate a headline on their own. However, they add up to something unmistakable when you step back and look at the full picture. Symbols of power are shifting rapidly within the palace walls. When Camilla walked into Westminster Abbey wearing the modified crown, it was a carefully chosen signal of her status. But that crown will one day sit on William's head as king. When that happens, the symbolic transfer will be so total that everything her previous public moments represented will be overwritten. The ongoing redistribution of royal patronages has been active since 22. Sources suggest King Charles has been involved in these decisions in ways that quietly shape the family's future influence. Personally, Camilla's world is shrinking in very visible ways. She recently sold Ray Millhouse, her beloved private country home. There was no press release or carefully managed announcement, but rather a sudden listing on the open market. People do not part with their personal sanctuaries unless something has shifted fundamentally in their future outlook. Right now, she moves through multiple royal residences as a matter of course. That picture changes completely when the current reign inevitably ends. At that point, the properties pass directly to William, and Buckingham Palace becomes his primary residence. Sources suggest her likely inheritance consists of a modest trust and the right to use smaller non-state properties. These are significant assets by any normal measure, but they are completely inadequate compared to her current position. She would go from queen consort with the weight of the monarchy behind her to a dowager duchess living at the discretion of the new king. Her wider family network is being systematically dismantled alongside her security. Her son is gone from any official association with the estate payroll, and her family's access to royal spaces is finished. Their broader proximity to crown events is quietly but steadily narrowing. Sources suggest the palace is dismantling this network piece by piece with a patience that speaks to genuine long-term intent. To complicate matters, her son's name has appeared in older, sensitive financial documents. There is no evidence of criminal wrongdoing, but the association is real and documented. Sources suggest the king has made his position completely clear to Camilla. He has demanded she distance her family from these estate privileges permanently, or accept the consequences. Camilla has not fully complied with these strict royal demands. She views ending her family's integration into royal estates as both personally impossible and fundamentally unfair. The king, however, views her continued push as evidence of exactly the kind of judgment failure that justifies his concerns. He made a phone call to her in the early spring that sources describe as incredibly difficult. The conversation was not angry or accusatory, but rather quiet and deeply pained. He is 77 years old and maintaining his public duties with genuine discipline despite his ongoing health battles. But discipline is not the same as physical strength. The choice before him has become an agonizing and impossible dilemma. Protecting her son's access would mean telling his own heir to back down. William would not comply, and Charles knows it. It would also mean telling Princess Anne to stop her estate reviews. Anne would not comply, and he knows that too. He is the man who conducted the affair that Diana described in terms of profound personal devastation. How do you argue against your son's grief when you are the reason that grief exists in the first place? There's a version of this story that looks like simple revenge, portrays the crown systematically dismantling everything Camilla built as payback for what she did to Diana. And there's another version that looks like something more considered and more lasting than revenge. Sources suggest the second version is closer to the truth. Simple revenge would look like Camilla being publicly humiliated and stripped of everything in one dramatic moment. That is not what sources describe the king and his heirs as building. Think about what Diana actually stood for, not the fairy tale image, but the real substance of her work. She touched patients when the establishment was still treating illness as something shameful. She walked through active minefields to make a point about weapons and sat with the vulnerable. She did all of this against the active resistance of an institution that found her popularity destabilizing. She was right about all of it, and the institution was wrong. Now, her son is preparing to run the institution. Sources suggest William's modernization agenda is Diana's legacy expressed institutionally. He is building the emotional intelligence and public accountability she was told were dangerous into the architecture of the monarchy. Princess Anne's contribution runs parallel to this mission. Her decades of quiet, impactful work represent a living argument against performative royalty. This is the exact argument Diana made and paid everything to make. Here's what sources suggest Camilla is slowly and painfully coming to understand. She won the battle by getting the man, the title, and the seat beside the king. But the war was never about Charles. It was about Diana, what she represented, whether the institution she tried to change would eventually become worthy of her sacrifice. The palace is building that institution now, not for revenge, but for Diana's legacy. Camilla has no counter-strategy for this unfolding reality. You cannot argue against a legacy, nor can you outmaneuver a son who spent decades deciding quietly what to do. Diana never got to see what this monarchy could become. She got a Paris tunnel, 2 boys left without a mother, and an institution that barely lowered its flag. But sources suggest something is happening inside that palace right now that she never lived to see. Her son and her closest allies are moving together to reshape everything Camilla's family built. They are turning it into something Diana would have recognized as her own. It's not revenge, but something better than revenge. That something is legacy. And that, more than any property dispute or estate decision, is what sources describe as Camilla's darkest reality.